and I'm here at Britpart in Shropshire with Managing Director Paul Myers. Hello, Paul.
Hi. Hi.
Now, what have we got here?
This is a pair of EGR valves, exhaust gas recirculation valves, for a 2.7 or 3 litre V6 Discovery or Range Rover Sport engine.
Right, okay, and there are two, one for each bank of cylinders?
One for each bank of cylinders, correct, yeah.
Okay, so would you recommend, if you're replacing them, to, even if only one fails, do them both at the same time?
If you don't know the history of a car and when they were last changed, yes, we'd recommend that you do a pair at the same time, because if one's gone, the other one could be quite soon to go as well.
Fair enough. Okay, well, to show you how to do just that, let's go to the workshop and have a chat with Martin.
Okay, we're going to tackle the left side of the engine first. And on the left side of the engine, you'll notice there's some air conditioning pipes running down this side where we need to access the EGR valve. So we've had the aircon degassed. You'll need to have that done professionally if you're going to work on the car yourself. We've also removed the big plastic engine cover. That just involves undoing the oil filler cap and popping it off its rubber mounts. So this is the new valve. Bolts to the engine like that, in that sort of position. But in order to get to it, we need to remove the battery tray cover, the battery, and the lower part of the tray, which makes access a lot easier. So that's what we're going to do first. Battery cover just unclips. Disconnect the battery terminals and the battery clamp and lift the battery out. Terminals are a 13mm and the battery clamps are an 8mm. And they're undone. Battery clamp just lifts out. Can then wiggle each terminal clamp off the battery posts. Make sure they're well and truly tucked aside so they can't contact the battery as you lift it out. Tuck the earth right over the back and then carefully lift the battery out of the tray and place it aside. Once that's out of the way, this side panel can come off the battery tray. So release the big connector, tuck that down the back. You've then got an 8mm screw that holds the aircon pipe to the bottom of the battery tray. So we'll undo that next. And this side portion's held in just with a series of clips. So reach down, release the two side ones and the two front ones. Once that's loose, you can slide it out from under the battery cable. Next, there's 3 13mm nuts that hold this portion of the battery tray in place, so we can release them. Okay, once that's unbolted, there's this small L-shaped piece that you can just slide out from underneath the cowling, place that aside, and then this battery tray will lift out. Just ease the aircon pipes over, slide it up off its studs. And with that out, you've got a really clear view of the EGR valve. So next, as we've already said, we've degassed the aircon with a professional machine. The aircon pipes are held together with 2 8mm screws. So we're going to release them. Once the aircon system is broken into, we can then tuck these pipes up out of the way so we've got loads of room to work. So once the bolts are undone, we can now ease the two pipes apart and then tuck them aside. So tuck them towards the front of the engine, just take care not to damage the two O-rings. Once they're out of the way, just got one more thing to remove before we can start work on removing the valve, and that's this little sound deadening cover. That's just held in place with 2 clips. Release them and then wiggle it forwards. And with that removed, got a good view of the EGR valve. So when it comes to removing the valve, the first thing we're going to take off is the pipe that runs from the valve into the air intake plenum on top of the engine. It's got 2 8mm screws that hold it to the valve. There's a single 8mm that holds a clamp to the timing belt cover. And then the last thing to remove is this metal clip. It's like a metal clamp that holds the pipe to the plenum. So just use a large screwdriver, get it in there, bit of a wiggle, and that will release. It's worth buying some new clamps while you do this job because they can get damaged and bent and twisted. So just remove that from the pipe. And now this pipe can be lifted away. Next up, we need to release the dipstick tube from the side of the engine, and we're going to loosen the bolts holding the EGR cooler to the side of the engine as well to give us a little bit more room to move. So the dipstick tube has 10mm bolt holding it tight. So just loosen that off. Ratchet spanners are really helpful in this job because obviously, although you can see a lot more, access is still a little bit restricted. So there's one bolt holding that to the EGR cooler, and then there's another that holds it to the cylinder head. So you need to undo both of those. I can see already, looking down the hole where that pipe came off, that this valve is quite gunked up with soot. So because we don't know if this vehicle's ever had EGR valves changed before, that's why we're going to do both. So that's the dipstick bolts out. We just need to bring the dipstick away from the engine a little way. So next, we've got an 8mm screw at the back on the EGR cooler, and then there's 3 that hold the EGR valve to the side of the engine. So top one's easy to get to. Once they're broken free, you can pretty much spin them out with your fingers most of the time. Although we've made access easier, they are still fiddly to get at, so you need a little bit of perseverance to get these bolts out. Although we've stripped out quite a lot so you can see what you're doing, it is still quite a fiddly job, so do persevere, take your time. So you'll notice that a couple of the bolts will come out all the way, but one will have to stay with the valve until we remove it because there's not enough room for it to slide out all the way. And it looks like this vehicle has had an EGR valve change this side before because one of the front bolts is missing. So we can now move on to unbolting the cooler from the side of the engine. That's got one 8mm that holds the cooler to the side of the cylinder head. And there should be an L-shaped bracket that supports a coolant pipe, but that's missing as well. So someone's not done the job properly before, but it does make our lives easier. Can take a bit of experimenting with different extensions and sockets to get the right combination to release these bolts just because of where they are. Another challenge is once you've got the bolts released is getting hold of them so they don't fall into the engine bay. So that's that. So there's another one of these steel clips which connects the EGR cooler to a metal pipe at the back of the engine. So next we need to release that so we can bring the EGR cooler nice and high so we can get to the 2 bolts that secure the valve to the cooler. So take a flathead screwdriver, carefully undo that clip. Which is obviously fiddlier due to where it is, but you should be able to get it unclipped like that. Once it's unclipped, you just have to pry it apart and then we can remove it. That's why it's important to have some spares on standby just in case they do get damaged when you remove them because they can be a little bit flimsy. Yeah, that one's, as you can see, the tang's bent over on that one. So, with that undone, we can just ease the dipstick tube away from the side of the engine a little bit. We've got an electrical connector to release on the EGR valve, which is held on by a single plastic tab. That just unclips like so. Tuck that aside. And now we can carefully wiggle the valve and the cooler away from the side of the engine and bring it up so we can get to the torx screws that hold the 2 pieces together. So because there's some more movement in the valve now, we can get the final bolt out. then we can wiggle the whole assembly carefully up the side of the engine. And you won't have a great deal of access, but certainly a lot more access than you would if the valve was still bolted to the side. And the valve is held to the cooler with two T30 torx screws, so we need to undo those next. And the reason for leaving the cooler in place is just because it has a coolant pipe on top, which isn't too bad to release, but there's also one underneath. And if you get into releasing both pipes, you get a lot of coolant down the back of the engine, it makes a big mess. So if you can get away with not removing the cooler completely, it just makes life a lot easier. So next we'll just tackle those torx screws. Make sure the torx bit is located right in the torx screw before you try and undo it, otherwise it will round out and cause problems. So that's the first screw removed. We can just finish winding that out with our fingers. As you can see, it's a little torx screw with a T30 head. If you suspect that these have been off before, it's worth getting new ones because there's nothing worse than getting them almost all the way tight and then finding that the head's rounded out and you can't nip them up. So it's worth investing in them. So that's the first one. Once this inner bolt's undone, it's an idea to keep the torx screw in place on the cooler so that it makes it easier, because getting it in and out down the side of the engine can be a real pain. So you can do the last couple of turns on the torx screw by hand normally. Just take a bit of a wiggle with the valve just to free up the threads. Okay, once the screw's all the way undone, tuck it away somewhere safe, and then remove the old valve along with the gasket. So once the old valve's off, you'll be able to see all the carbon build up around the valve, and that's what causes it to stick and eventually fail. So with this out the way and the old gasket retrieved, we can get ready to fit the new one. It can be a bit tricky to lower the valve and its new gasket down into place. And one option is to stick the gasket to the valve with a little bit of sealant or Hylamar. The problem with that is if you get it just slightly off, the bolts can be really tricky to start. So if you can do it without, it's even better. So first of all, we'll get we start with the outer screw, and then we'll do the inner one last because that's the hardest one to access. So first of all, get your torx driver, and you can use a little bit of plastic wrapping over the end of the torx bit and then the screw, and that helps hold it in place so that it doesn't drop off. So take that, feed it through the cooler, like so. Next, take the gasket, slide that over the bolt, and then finally we can lower the valve into place. Just engage that thread and start screwing that bolt in by hand. Obviously you don't want to put a ratchet on it straight away, because if you do get it even just a little bit cross-threaded, it won't go in and the valve will probably be damaged. When you're sure that it's started, you can nip that one up, and that will help close the gap between the valve and the cooler, so that when you fit the other screw, it should just start really easily. So once you've almost got the screw nipped up, you can position the gasket and then slide the other screw through. So reach underneath and make sure that the gasket holes line up. Nip that screw up a little bit more just to hold it in place. Once you're sure that the gasket's aligned properly, you can just nip this outer screw up enough to hold it all in place, and that will make fitting the inner screw much easier. So just give that a little tweak. Take your inner screw, you can use the same trick you did for the outer one with a bit of plastic, again because it's a bit of a fiddly thing to get started. And then you'll need to ease the valve away from the engine just to get enough clearance to get the screw started again. Obviously we're going into that inner hole this time. So bring the valve out, push the screw through the cooler. Again, it's really important to start this by hand before you put a ratchet on there, just to make sure that the threads are happy and that they're not going to cross thread. once that bolt's started, you can get your ratchet on it with your torx bit and take that all the way home. Again, it's one of those things where when you've done a few, they get a lot easier, but hopefully you only have to do yours once. So the inner bolt is all the way through, so we're going to fully tighten that one, position the valve, and then we're going to fully tighten the outer one. So just hold the valve, tighten that screw up. That one's tight. Now we can lower the cooler and the valve back down to the side of the engine, making sure that the metal fitting locates in the pipe, because we'll have to refit a new clamp to that, and that's that in position. When we removed the valve, you might remember that one of these bolts didn't come all the way out because there's not enough room for it, so we need to make sure we position this in the hole on the valve before we offer it back up to the side of the engine. That's the top one. So just put that in a couple of turns to make sure it stays in place. Then we can fully tighten the outer screw. Don't be tempted to use the old gaskets, because when they leak, they make a really annoying whistling sound and it will drive you mad. So that's now tight. And we can continue bolting the valve up to the side of the engine. As with anything, you don't want to fully tighten any of the bolts until you've got all of them started in their threads. So you want to refit the 3 EGR bolts first, and then the small 8mm headed one that holds the cooler to the side of the block. Once that one's started, we can now tighten them all up. They're all tight, so you can plug the electrical connector back in. Just pushes on, you hear it click when it's in place. Okay, so next we need to refit a new metal clip to where the EGR cooler joins the pipe at the back of the engine. This can be a little bit fiddly, so feed it in by hand to begin with, then latch it over the first way, and then you need to use a special tool to finish the job, and it will click when it's fully home. So make sure it's fully all the way around the clamp where the two pieces join. And then we use some long nose pliers to get it the first way. That will hold it in place. So now we can get the special tool. So this special tool is really handy for clips that are a bit difficult to access, like this one. And how it works is you've got these two tangs on the end of the cable. As you pull the pliers together, it compresses the clip and latches it in place. So we need to feed this down onto the clip, and then we can tighten it by pulling the pliers. So make sure it's all the way onto the clip before you pull them. So once you've heard a click, that clamp is in place. We need to keep these pliers handy because we need them for the top pipe a little bit later. So next, we can refit the dipstick tube. So offer that up to the side of the EGR cooler and to the side of the engine. And that has these 10mm screws. Again, get both of them started before we tighten them up. And then ratchet spanner to do those two up. So they're now tight, and we can refit the top pipe with a new gasket. So another new gasket for this one. So this fits between the pipe and the top of the EGR valve. So just take care when you're fitting this that it doesn't fall off and slip down the side of the engine. once you've got everything lined up, it's the two 8mm headed screws to join the pipe onto the top of the EGR valve. Again, start them by hand, make sure they're not cross-threaded. Make sure the gasket holes are lined up properly. When you know that they're both threaded properly, you can then tighten them up with a ratchet. Don't forget the screw that holds the bracket to the front of the timing cover. Now we can bring the aircon pipes back round to where they meet the bulkhead fittings, and we can fit a top clamp. This one released okay, so we can reuse it. Slide it around where the pipes join. When you know it's in place correctly, you can use the pliers again. Make sure the pliers grip around both sides of the clamp and then squeeze until it clicks into place. Make sure it's fully engaged and that pipe's finished. So now we can reconnect our air conditioning pipes. Before you do that, you just want to make sure the O-rings aren't damaged or twisted, otherwise you could have a leak. These both look okay, so we can slide the pipes back into place. And then resecure them with the two screws. Again, once you finish the job, you have to have the air conditioning system regassed by a specialist if you don't happen to have an aircon machine. It's a good idea to support the pipes as you tighten the two screws up, because they will try and twist and you don't want to damage them. So just prevent them from turning while you nip the screws up. That's all back together. So now it's just a case of refitting the plastics and we can move on to the other side. So here we are on the other side of the engine bay. As you can see, we've already removed this part of the plastic tray. It's exactly the same process as doing the other side, except you haven't got a massive, great heavy battery to lift out. So from here, there's a few added complications on this side in the form of the brake vacuum pipe work, these coolant pipes, and also the two fuel pipes, which need to be moved out of the way. So to begin with, we'll unclip the brake vacuum pipe work from the vacuum pump, and that can be lifted out. So we're going to avoid disconnecting these coolant pipes, because again, we're going to leave the cooling system undisturbed so we don't have a big mess to clear up. The only thing we do need to take into account is we're going to need to unclip the two fuel pipes from the top of the engine, so have something absorbent ready to clean up any diesel that may spill out. So we'll begin by unclipping these pipes from the vacuum pump. So just reach down the back, and there's two quick release connectors. There's one, and the second one. And then there's this connector at the top here. Just pinch the two plastic tabs, undo this clip, and that can be lifted out. Next, we need to release the two fuel pipes and then unbolt the fuel pipe bracket from the side of the engine. That's a 10mm bolt. So just ease the coolant pipes back. They're quite robust. They don't mind being pulled out of the way for things too much. Loosen that bolt off. And the fuel pipes can stay clipped to that bracket. They're only held on with two plastic clips, but they're really fragile. So if you can avoid damaging them by unclipping the fuel pipes, then that's a bonus. Get that screw out of the way. So we've got another two plastic clips here. This pipe's already released, so just carefully pull that out, release that fuel pipe. Now we can undo these two quick release connectors, which go onto the Schrader valve for bleeding the fuel system. So we're going to get some absorbent pad. Just get ready for the diesel to come out. Push that tab in, release that one, swing that around out of the way. And this one, which goes onto the Schrader valve, again, push the tab, bit of a wiggle, and that will come out. Haven't lost too much, but just tuck some cloth or something underneath to soak up any fuel. And you can see that bracket now floats away from the side of the engine, enough to give us access to everything else. So now we can unbolt and remove this top pipe like we did the other side. So get your screwdriver in there, release that clip like so. just open it up and then pull that out of the way. So now we can undo the 8mm screw that holds the bracket to the timing cover. And finally, 2 screws that hold this pipe onto the top of the EGR valve. So once those 2 screws are undone, we can withdraw the pipe and the old gasket, get rid of that. Now we can move on to releasing the EGR valve and cooler from the side of the engine. So that's more 8mm headed screws. Get the ratchet spanner out again. That's the first screw. Got all 3 this side. Second one, and then the last one is at the top. And all 3 are free to come out this side. You don't need to worry, they won't hit anything. There's plenty of access for them to come out. So now we need to release the metal clamp that holds the EGR cooler to the pipe at the back of the engine. So take a flat blade screwdriver again. Just get it in between the clamp and give it a twist. Once that's released, you can withdraw it from the engine bay. Again, it's worth having these on standby because they do get damaged when you remove them, especially the ones at the back because they're difficult to get to. So now we need to remove the 8mm screw that holds the EGR cooler to the side of the engine. That's just above the clamp that you've released. I'm just going to put a light down here so I can see what I'm doing. Place that aside. Now we can disconnect the electrical connector on the EGR valve. Again, same as the other side, it's just a little plastic tab. You have to flick up and then remove the connector. So, tuck that aside. Now, the whole assembly is loose on the side of the engine. We can undo the 2 torx screws that hold the 2 together and withdraw the valve. This is why it's handy to have the fuel pipes disconnected, because there's plenty of movement down here to get onto the screws. This is the metal bracket that holds the fuel pipes, so it looks like someone's already unclipped them in the past and the plastic clips have broken, so that's just fallen out. So now we can undo the 2 torx screws that hold the EGR valve to the cooler. And this is when it's handy to have the fuel pipes loose, because you can just ease them away from the side of the engine to get the torx bit engaged. And because the valve and cooler can now move as well, it makes the job a lot easier. Because of the position of these screws, it's handy to have a telescopic magnet so that when they're loose, they don't fall into the engine bay. So once you've got it unwound, get the magnet on and just pick it out like that. Now the inner one, as with the other side, is a bit trickier to get to, so you might have to experiment again with your extensions to make sure you can get a good positive drive on it. Only apply a decent amount of pressure to the ratchet to crack the screw off when you're certain that the torx bit is engaged, because if you do round the screw out, it'd be really difficult to remove. Once it's broken free, you can spin it out by hand and then use your magnet again to retrieve the screw. Remove the screw. And now you can manoeuvre the coolant pipe and remove the valve along with the old gasket. So again, really black and sooty inside. The valve is actually shut on this side, it's not stuck open or anything, so it's possible that the valve's okay, but as we've done the other side, it makes sense to do this one as well. So now we can take our new valve and our new gasket. As with the other side, we're going to start the outer screw first, so it makes aligning the gasket a lot easier to then start the other screw. So manoeuvre that into place. That can just sit there until we've got the other screw through the cooler. You can actually use the magnet again to get the screw into place without fear of dropping it. Let's push that through the cooler, withdraw the magnet. You need a bit of a gap between the valve and the cooler at this point, obviously, to fit the gasket. So just sit that back, push the screw through, slide the gasket over the screw, and now we can offer the valve up to the cooler. Once it's in place, take your extension and the torx socket again. Apply some pressure to the screw and start it in the threads. And then once that's just snug, we can line up the inner screw, get that started in the threads, and then tighten both of them up. Again, just reach underneath, make sure the gasket is aligned properly before you try and fit the second screw. Get it started in the hole, and then take the extension with the socket on again from behind. And then start it in the valve, making sure the gasket hasn't slipped down, because if you miss the gasket and tighten everything up, it'll make a really annoying whistling sound. So once both the screws are started, you can then put your ratchet on the extensions and tighten them up. Once the inner screw's tight, you can move on to the outer one. So just giving that a final tighten. And once both those torque screws are tightened up, we can now bolt the valve and the cooler back to the side of the engine. Again, make sure the metal pipe at the back of the engine engages properly with the cooler before you bolt it up. And then start each of the bolts by hand. Again, you want to get all three of the EGR screws started, and then the cooler screw, and then we can fit that metal clamp and tighten everything up. So that's all three EGR screws almost all the way in. Now we can fit the cooler screw. Once that's in place, we can fit our new clamp. Get it in position by hand, and then use some long nose pliers to get it started. We hear it latch over once. So now we can secure it the whole way with these pliers. Quite limited space to work with because the brake master cylinder's in the way, but you can get them in. And then carefully squeeze them until the clip latches in place, like that. Now we can finish tightening all the fixings. Once you finish tightening the 3 EGR bolts and the single cooler bolt, we can refit the top pipe and the electrical connector. So here's that top pipe with the new gasket. Take care not to drop the gasket. On this side, it can be easier if you lay it over the end of the pipe and then push the screws through, and they will hold it in place. Then you can lower the pipe back onto the engine. Make sure it engages in the plenum. And then you can start the bolts by hand. Once both bolts are wound in, you can tighten them up. and then refit the bracket screw. And then we can refit the top pipe clamp onto its union there. So get it close with the long nose pliers first on the first click, like that, and then take the clamp pliers to finish it off, like that. You hear it click, give it a little tap. So we can refit the fuel pipe bracket next. It's got the single hole where the bolt goes through, and also this metal tang that fits into the side of the engine. Once it's in place, just tighten it up with the ratchet. So you can see the plastic clips here on the pipes, these two barbed plastic clips that clip into the front of that bracket. So carefully maneuver the pipes into place. Slot them in. As you can see, those barbed pieces just pass through the front of the bracket and hold them steady. And then clip the pipes into the coolant rail. 1, 2. And now they can be reconnected to the Schrader valve just with the quick release connectors. You'll hear them snap when they're in place. That's the first one. And the second one. So next we can move on to the brake vacuum pipe. Slide it in down to the vacuum pump. Can be a bit fiddly just because of where the vacuum pump is. The larger pipe at the top. You hear it snap into place, and then the smaller one. Get it onto its pipe and then just push it and it will snap into place. Refit this bracket which holds it off the coolant pipe. And then finally reconnect it to the brake servo. So the last thing to do is to connect the EGR valve with the grey multi-plug. Just slide it into the top and then it should click into place. So now we just need to refit the sound deadening pad and the plastic trays. And if the vehicle had an engine management light on for an EGR fault, you will need to have it plugged into a diagnostic computer and the fault codes reset. So now we've got 2 brand new Britpart EGR valves fitted to this engine, and it will do many more thousands of miles without issue. And don't forget to check out the other videos in the Britpart Workshop series.